Guy McPherson here again with Neil Shepard, and we're going deep again, which I understand will take a little time. So please bear with us and have some patience as we cover materials that are rarely discussed within contemporary society. Last time we talked a lot about electricity. We're going to go a little bit more broadly this time around. So, Neil, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So this time we're going to revisit the highlights of just how we came to find ourselves in the current predicament. We're going to look back at the last 100 to 200 years of industrial progress and see how the rise of industrial civilization and the use of fossil fuels on a grand scale correlates with changes in global temperature, atmospheric CO2, and other changes in Earth's atmosphere and systems. So let's plunge right in. We're going to review some data here. We've done so much, but would be instructive to review just for context. This is 1750 to 2022, the correlation of atmospheric carbon dioxide compared to our annual emission, measuring as best we can how much we've emitted and burned, and looking at the corresponding measurements that we've done of CO2 in the atmosphere. The two are different, and so when you graph them together, are we in fact measuring an increase in CO2 at the same time that we know we're emitting more? Thoughts on this, Guy?
Well, it's pretty clear that there was already carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1750, about 280 parts per million, maybe a little less. But look at how we managed to catch up by burning fossil fuels. We're still behind the amount that's in the atmosphere. We're not emitting nearly as much as in the atmosphere in 1900, in 1930, until about 1960, which was the year of my birth, and as I recall, yours. That's when we really began to make a major contribution to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Is about at the time of my birth. I'm not claiming full responsibility, you understand, but holy cow, that's a rather incredible increase in carbon dioxide emissions after about 1940 and especially after 1960.
I agree. And in fact, I just look at this and see that here we were, there was kind of a baseline of how much we were emitting before the invention of the steam engine in around 1712 by Newcomen, with James Watt in 1764 with the improvements in condensate steam. The steam engine really takes off, and we should remember that the steam engine was invented for the express purpose of accelerating the extraction of coal. Coal was already being used at scale for heating and for industrial purposes like steelmaking. Its use accelerated with the invention of the steam engine, which required coal. Coal really hits in the late 1700s and then becomes a much bigger source of what we're doing in the mid 1800s. And I look at this chart and I see that we're adding emissions very significantly. And then the measured CO2 really starts to go up as we add. And then to your point, after World War II, we rocket up with what we're adding and emitting. Lo and behold, kind of Homer Simpson level, what we measure in the atmosphere rockets up. So I don't think there's any doubt these are correlated. They're related. They're causally related. There's usually someone from the asshole department that will try and say, well, the planet has emitted CO2 from other sources in the past, and maybe it's just doing so coincidentally with us doing so.
Well, this is what Michael Mann called the hockey stick, based on a paper he wrote, published in Nature. He was the lead author on this paper, published in 1980, as I recall. So this is what he called the hockey stick, the dramatic increase in carbon dioxide emissions.
We will get to the hockey stick, but yes, this is it. And zoomed out, it's even more of a hockey stick. Let's just remind ourselves, what are those carbon dioxide emissions from? We're not blind to this. We can measure it. We can calculate fairly accurately how much oil we've dug out and burned, how much coal, how much natural gas, and again, this land use change, which is everything we do when we rip the land into pieces. We change wetlands to drylands or drylands to wetlands. When we cut down forests and turn it into farmland, you might think, well, it's still growing stuff. It's just growing stuff. How could that change? It changes it profoundly.
Well, yes, the profound change is something that essentially anybody can see unless they're paid to not see it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of those people out there.
And you just look at the volume, the carbon dioxide emissions in 1880, it's not like there were zero, but what we've done since. And this is just what we measure by knowing what we've burned and what proportion. Let's look at it in relation to populations, 1900 to 2015 in tiny numbers down there. And it is world population and total global fossil fuel consumption. So are these correlated, Guy, or is there some coincidence
They're
here?
very clearly correlated with each other. And the orange, that's the total fossil fuel consumption. And notice we were not burning much in 1900, even until there was the first billion people on the planet, about at 40% of the way into this graph. But then we began the great catching up.
That's true. And you can see with the fossil fuel consumption, we do see the effects of probably this is the Great Depression in here, this little bump here. And of course, 2015, this little bump here is 2008, the great financial crash. But humans are still doing the jumpy and boom, boom, and producing a population curve that's pretty smooth, just keeps going up.
If there's one thing we do well, it's creating more of ourselves.
Self-replicating automata. Let's look at CO2 concentration and fossil fuel consumption. Again, these are closely correlated. The fossil fuels we consume and the CO2 concentration measured in the atmosphere, 1900 to 2015. So there's just the last 115 years. Let's look at temperature anomaly and fossil fuel consumption. So this is us measuring the temperature and in correlation to what we consume in fossil fuels.
And again, a very close correspondence there. You'd be hard to argue otherwise.
Right. And temperature tends to be an oscillator. So people wonder, well, why would it be cooler for a few years or decades and then warmer? And does that mean we were necessarily doing something during the cool period here where you see that it went down for a couple decades, but then it went up and it's average, the best fit line. It's on a trend and most recently rocketing up, inexorably climbing higher. If you look at the last, again, this is 2015 here, 1900 here. So this is approximately World War II. It's been rocketing up pretty much since World War II.
And there's a lot of variation. To be fair, there's El Nino and La Nina, which cause a lot of that variation in temperature. And that's because the El Nino and La Nina do the opposite things in terms of storing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases
Good
in
point.
the ocean.
And they oscillate on what, a 10, 15, or even 20-year cycle?
Yes, that's right.
That would be part of why we're seeing these. This is spiky here. Again, since World War II, people forget, if you look at the 1940 US Census, we were 34% agrarian before World War II. And World War II changed everything. It turned us into a 80% or 90% industrial and urban service economy. And farming today is what, 1%, 2%, depending on how you count it. It's not 33%.
Right. It's a very rare individual who can make a living at farming anymore.
In any form, even just as an employee of a major farm.
Right. And my father-in-law and his family were farmers, and they spent their lives being disparaged as a result of that
Oh my
choice they
God.
made. And, these are the people who grow food for the rest of the country and beyond. And people act as if they're the most idiotic people on the planet.
I've never understood that.
Try to grow some food, people. You'll figure out that you're not nearly as smart as you thought you were.
That's right. And then here is the hockey stick. What we've been able to scientifically measure, and I just will give the context here. This chart goes from 800,000 years to the present. This maroon colored arrow is what the scientists have measured at Mauna Loa and other stations worldwide since about 1958, correct, Guy?
Yes.
This light blue line says ice core data. It was only in the 70s or 80s when you and I were basically teens or after we're 20 and we're in college that scientists were able to reliably measure the contents of gas bubbles in ice cores dug up that represent 800,000 or more years. And they found this oscillation of CO2 over 800,000 years between a band of 300 and 170. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. And I know I've seen a reasonable explanation for that variation between 175 and 250 or 300.
Well, it's glaciation and deglaciation. When you have deglaciation, you have growth in green plants and a much greater cover of biota, which is releasing CO2 in the normal course of biotic things. We should not forget that living systems produce many of the greenhouse gases we've talked about, whereas there are natural systems that give off the following greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and a few others. These are part of life, right, Guy? We can't, it's not just, the answer isn't we want zero of these gases or we would expect them never to be present. They're present because of life. Oxygen, it's critical to life. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely.
If we
And
have living systems, we're going to have carbon dioxide and methane cycling up and down with the seasons, with the changes in glaciation, with other cycles that are non-human. They're not anthropogenic. But what we have here at the end of this is this anthropogenic explosion of carbon dioxide. That's the point. It's so hard to just get people to see the simple truth of this anthropogenic change.
right. And you see in 2023, it was 419.3 parts per million. It's now well over 420. Last number I saw was 422, I believe, or 423.
Indeed.
So
And
it's not rocketing down like it rocketed up.
I think our birth year, 1960, you can go on the web and say birth year carbon dioxide and find out whatever year you were born, what was the average level. And I think we are 319. So literally it has gone up 100 just since 1960 when we were born.
This is the very definition of hashtag winning, isn't it?
We're getting better. We're getting more every year. And so this chart is measuring global temperature. We have fairly reliable thermometers, the mercury thermometers and other reliable thermometers since 1880, and very reliable since World War II and modern science, even far more reliable. And what we see is temperature rocketing up since about 1880. And we are able to measure, again from ice cores, indirect temperature measurement of where the temperature was in the pre-industrial period. And again, it's rocketing up. These are degrees Fahrenheit. If this is zero, we're up about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a little over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is the Celsius scale over here. So we're up one, what is it? Everyone wants to keep to 1.5 Celsius.
Yes, and governments of the world admitted in October of 2023 that we were beyond two.
Right. But there's still some people and some .org, some NGOs that want your donations to keep us under 1.5.
Of course they do. They're organizations that want my money for a lot of things.
And have you let them know that you don't have any?
Oh, yes. Yes, generally they send their requests to my partner and she doesn't have any money either.
So here's a comparison. What this shows is the blue line, this smoothly rising blue line over a period of 20,000 years, is what geologists estimate as the rate at which carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere just preceding what is called the PETM. I believe that stands for the Permian Eocene thermal maximum, 56 million years ago. A much more gradual heating of the planet, which coincides with what we measure as a disappearance of 70 to 80% of all species of all life that existed at that time. And then in the red, we have a representation of the rate and the amount the temperature is rising today compared to what we measure as the temperature rise during and preceding the PETM extinction. And so this chart has to be long from left to right to even try and show the rise of the PETM, but the red line shows the rate of the slope of the line is straight up. This dramatizes that when you say that it isn't just the case that the temperature is rising, because it has risen in previous eras. Earth was once much hotter. I mean, there wasn't much life, but it was much hotter than it is now. But your point has consistently been it is the rate of change.
Right.
Am I reading this correctly?
Yes, absolutely. This is the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. And as you indicated, it occurred about 56 million years ago, and it was characterized by a 5 to 8 C warming of the planet. We can't get much more precise than that because, again, it was 56 million years ago, and we weren't wandering around with a bunch of thermometers at that point. But whether it was 5 degrees or 8 degrees C, that's an enormous number in a relatively short period of time from a geological perspective.
And so the point that one might make from this is even that rate in the blue line that it increases over 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years was like a lightning round for most life forms. It resulted in life forms not being able to live where they formerly lived. And some of them may have migrated, but many of them just went extinct. Is that correct?
Yes, it's very difficult for ecological entities, including species, to keep up with that very rapid rate of environmental change. That's a hugely important factor that few people other than ecologists understand.
And another response might be, well, that was natural, the rise of the PETM, and it was the planet doing what it does. Humans were not involved. But in this red slope here, humans are definitely involved. Human activity, human population growth, what we're doing with our population. And the two are related. We have not been able to grow. Is it fair to say we would not have been able to grow the population from 1 billion in 1880 to over 8 billion today without harnessing those geometrically more slaves that are represented in terms of work and energy by our use of fossil fuels? We would not have
Yes,
been able to achieve this population.
absolutely. It's a Faustian bargain. We enjoy enormous privilege, including the ability to grow food. A few people growing food for a lot of people as a result of fossil fuels. There's no going back. It's not like we could take a poll and everybody involved, more than 8 billion people would say, yeah, I've had enough of the ability to drive to work or to drive to whatever.
I'm going to walk or ride a horse everywhere that I have to go and carry stuff that I need and grow everything I need. We will be looking at that. So we find ourselves, again, closing with our chart. The theory that modern civilization is the result of taking advantage of a carbon pulse. We are within a civilization that is highly unusual and dependent on a carbon pulse. And it had a beginning, it has a middle at some point, it has a peak at some point. And whether you think we're just on the left side of the peak and not quite there yet, and it's going to peak in the future, or we're already on the downslope. But the downslope there is. It's not going to be a steady state. It's not going to just branch off to the right at some steady state. We're using it up, and we will get to a post-carbon future one way or another. That I can assure you. Will it be because we've intelligently decremented or reduced our demand and our use and somehow kept a thing called a civilization, or will it be a little more bumpy? What are your thoughts, Guy?
I think the only indication of bumps will be the really hard bumps on the way down this very slippery slope. We've known about this for a really long time, largely as a result of M. King Hubbard's work. And what have we done? Increased demand. That's
Mm.
what
And we've just elected someone who has pledged a kind of there's a phrase out there, you can Google it, fossil fascism. It means fascism fueled with even more accelerated commitment to fossil fuels and only fossil fuels. Fossil fascism, look it up, folks. That's who we have elected, and that's what the Americans have chosen. It is the case that a majority of voting Americans at this time, knowing who he was from his previous total wreckage of an administration, have embraced this. And complaining of high prices and inflation of prices due to the increasing costs of the fossil fuels that we depend on. And just that, just having come back from Asia, where they would tell us we Americans have an enviable economy at every level. But no, we Americans are unhappy, and we've voted in a combination of a clown and a fascist in one person. He's pledged to be a fossil fascist, in essence. When I think of fossil fascism, I think of none other than the character of the Deacon in the 1995 apocalyptic Kevin Costner movie, Waterworld, a movie actually very prophetic as it portrayed the result of global sea level rise from the aftermath of a complete meltdown of all of the ice caps, glaciers, and polar regions, all of Greenland, and all ice fields in the world, submerging most of the planet under 20 to 100 feet of water, with Kevin Costner as the mariner hero saving a woman and child from the marauding fossil fascists led by Dennis Hopper playing the deacon. They command the only remaining oil tanker able to produce gasoline resources for their internal combustion powered ski-doo engines and motorboats so that they can make repeated assaults on the remaining survivors who are clinging on islands and man-made floating greenhouse areas, clinging to life on the surface of the ocean. Dennis Hopper is the perfect figure for the fossil fascist of the present and future, someone who only cares about oil and fossil resources and will continue, even in the face of total planetary destruction and flooding, continues to pursue control of the remaining fossil resources. An incredibly prophetic film from 1995. Thoughts, Guy?
I think Joni Mitchell had it right in 1966. Those were the good old days. And that's a long time ago now. And what kind of significant advances have we made in the way we live our lives? I can't think of any, really. Yes, we have put somebody on the moon 3 years after that. And otherwise, I just don't see any major.
Well, for me, it's particularly poignant because I was a believer that if we had a device in our pocket, if you could put a device the size of a pack of cigarettes that would contain all of human knowledge, all books, all literature, all government proceedings, all laws, all data about the economy and society, and everyone could have that in their pocket, we would be a much more just and democratic and collaborative society. And we have that. Almost everyone has this device now in their pocket, and you can get almost everything that I talked about on it. Have we become more just and
Ah,
transparent and democratic and collaborative?
no, we've gone just the opposite direction, haven't we?
I thought it would mean we would be able to share a whole earth consciousness. This is when the whole earth catalog came into being. I thought it would finally give us what the whole earth catalog began in the late 60s and in the 70s, an access to tools and an understanding of whole systems. It showed how everything was connected or could be connected. Things in the world that make up a system, a human system and natural system. In 2005, Steve Jobs gave a commencement address where he remarked that the whole Earth catalog was like Google and the internet 35 years before those two things came along. That the whole Earth catalog was part of the impetus of what made Steve Jobs put all of this technology together so that we could have a device in our hand that delivers far more than the whole Earth catalog in terms of knowledge and access to tools. But somehow that has not worked quite as I think we all suspected that it would. The question to ask is the fact that everyone now has a device in their hands that delivers 1,000,000 times more knowledge and information than was in the whole Earth catalog. Has that meant that people have increased their whole Earth sensibility of openness, that we're all one family, that we have to pull together to solve planet scale problems, and that we should end wars, we should end competition over land and territory, we should end bias and persecution on the basis of religion or race or gender or any of that, you would think that that would accelerate with a whole systems consciousness, a whole Earth consciousness, the awareness that we've only had since the US space program of the Earth as a little blue marble. That should have increased dramatically with the arrival of a device in everyone's pocket that gives them access to 1,000,000 times more knowledge. But somehow that is not how it's worked out. What an irony. What an irony. And I was
That,
so wrong.
that is so sad
Mm.
because we do have all this knowledge and it's accessible to everybody. Unlike in the previous fascist era, when only the truly wealthy people had access to knowledge. Now, almost anybody can access any form of knowledge you want. How has that helped?
You and Pauline are in education, trying to educate and help our young people. Do they have more knowledge now in their heads at age 14 or 16 than what you remember we had in our heads when we were 14 or 16
Oh,
back
no.
in the 70s?
so much less. So a little online search will show you that although the IQ has remained at 100 plus or minus one for all the developed nations, for all so-called first world nations for the last 50 years, but the standard has changed.
Hmm.
So today, compared to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, our IQs are considerably lower than they were then.
So the knowledge society and the knowledge economy, you have to always be careful with these terms because what it will mean is that there's going to be less knowledge in people's heads
Right.
and
Yes.
less real knowledge used to make decisions and conduct our activities here.
And it's not that anybody wanted it this way, right? The people who were looking forward to and contributing to advanced technology that improved access to knowledge for all of us, basically, they didn't want to stand up stupider and stupider, but here we are.
Well, it's tragic. It's like an Aeschylus or Sophoclean tragedy where the Greek chorus would be off stage saying, "This was in your fate from the beginning," or "You chose this even though you didn't know you were choosing this." That's the role of the Greek chorus in these ancient dramas.
Right. And nobody likes to have that kind of thing pointed out to them. So
No,
nobody's
we'll
going to say,
bring.
oh, thank you so much for pointing out I'm an idiot. Thank you. That's great.
Right. So we will close the curtain on this episode.
That sounds like a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you.